Hi, it's Steve Hargadon, and welcome to the inaugural Future Museums Conference. What a delightful day. So looking forward to everything that's happening here. We've got Barry Joseph now, who's the Associate Director for Digital Learning at the Museum of Natural History. Barry, thanks so much for being here.
Steve, it's my pleasure. Thank you all for coming.
I'm going to go through a couple of intro slides here at the beginning. Thanks to NMC. Thanks to NMC and the Center for the Future of Museums as co-sponsors of the conference and co-chairs Alex Freeman and Elizabeth Merritt. This is a Learning Revolution project trying to bring together all of the learning professions and part of our larger set of conferences. Please do visit learningrevolution.com. And thanks to Blackboard Collaborate. Barry, there's a little bit of an echo with your mic on. Go ahead and turn that off, and you can turn it back on when you're ready to get started. So for those of you who are in the live room, look to the left of the map. You're looking for the star icon. You're going to click on that. Another set of icons will open out, and you can click on the star icon or the smiley face or whatever one you want, and then click on the map. And then put in the chat where you are, the time, the temperature. I'm in Park City, Utah, and it's 9:04 in the morning. It's another sunny day. And of course, to see where people are. Cloudy and sticky, of course, Washington, D.C. Go ahead and continue putting your notes in the chat, although I am going to move this slide forward. Turn the time over to Barry. And Barry, I'm here for the duration. Let me know how I can help you.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you for inviting me to be here with all of you for the next hour or so. I'm from New York. I speak fast. So I'm going to try to see if I can do a whole bunch of different things with you during this next period of time, including slowing down how I speak. And we'll see how long that lasts. I also just wanted to start by warning anybody watching this in the future who isn't here live that you might want to move on to a different presentation. I'm hoping to do something that is highly interactive, that might only make sense right now to those participating, and might not even make sense at all. Because part of what I want to do is something I've never done before, not like this. And if it's going to work, I'll need all of your help. So thank you for each and every one of you who responded to Steve's request to put in where you are in the weather. If you're doing this while you're multitasking and trying something else, I recommend stop. It's not going to work. It's not going to make any sense. In part because I need you. I need your involvement for this to work. And it's just not going to make sense over time. So again, all of those who already responded, like the person in Montgomery where it's hot and humid, and the person in Alberta where it's sunny, warming up nicely, and the person in Singapore where it's hot, thank you. And if you didn't, use this time now to share where you are. This is going to let me know that I'll have the participants I need to make what we're going to do together work. Before I begin, I just want to take a moment just to stare out at all of you, look at each of you, and appreciate you for coming today to the Future Museums Conference to explore with us these ideas about where museums are now, where they've been, waving back at you, Laura, and where they might be going. Yes, you all look nice. All right, let's begin with a story. I'm just finishing up my second year working at the American Museum of Natural History here in New York City. We are an object-based institution whose significance will become relevant shortly for what we'll be doing together. And last year, I was invited to travel to a local college to speak with some students about the innovative work we're doing with digital media to engage young people in informal science learning, using our collections. If you were in the last talk that Elizabeth gave, you heard her talk about how lovely they smell behind the scenes. The exhibits, our scientists, who do smell wonderful. And we're science educators. But I didn't want to come in with a PowerPoint or a presentation, and I wanted the students to be able to be actively engaged with me, not because they had to sit in the class and I was there to talk about my work at the museum and the education department, advancing digital learning, but because they actually were motivated and cared. So the best I could figure out on the way out was to just bring a bag. I don't know if it was this one, but a bag like this, with just lots of objects that I could find around my office. Hey, Alex. And on the way there, I wasn't sure exactly what I was going to do with them. But I was listening to one of my favorite podcasts, Radiolab. And while I can't remember the details at the moment, the broad strokes stand out. It was about some scientists who had discovered in the Alps a hiker who had died and been frozen in immaculate condition, not recently, but not hundreds, but thousands of years ago. And it was a tremendous find. And what the Radiolab piece did was talk about how the scientists figured out all the information they could to unwrap the history behind what could be learned from what they found. And it felt very much like a detective episode, like they were investigating and looking for clues. So with that in mind, I stepped into the classroom with my bag of objects, and on the spot, I told them, welcome to class. We're going to pretend it's 100 years in the future, and I am not Barry Joseph, but a computer representing Barry Joseph who knows everything he knew, everything he did, so everything he saw, up to last Friday where he was found dead in his office. And your job during the rest of our time together is to ask me questions, review the objects I've brought for you to share, and figure out what happened. Working together to solve this murder at the museum. So when I was invited to speak as a keynote, which I was quite flattered by at the Future Museums Conference, I wondered if we could do something like that together. If we can imagine, let's not push it 100 years into the future, but 50. And perhaps this is what classrooms will look like in 50 years, distributed, with video, with text chat. And I'm your resource over our next, let's say 40 minutes. I'll leave 10 minutes for breaking character. But during these next 40 minutes, I will stay in character. I will refer to our current present as the past, as I did during the class. And some people are going to come in now, and some students came in late that day. And they will be equally confused as those students were when I talked about those old things called magazines, when I referred to myself in third person, and they looked around the room to see why they were the only one who thought what I was saying was strange, because everyone else was like, yes, of course. So for this next period of time, you're going to need to use your chat to ask questions or respond to me. Steve might be able to explain better than I how to raise your hand, and you'll be able to use your voice to communicate. There is, in the participants list at the top, some icons. One is a hand. If you click it, it means hand up. But you can also let us know in the chat to watch. And if you guys are ready in the chat space, stay ready. I will wait until a quarter of us say they're ready. And let's begin. Welcome, everybody. I am Barry Joseph's avatar. I know everything I was programmed to know based on what Barry Joseph has seen and heard throughout his life up to the day before he was found dead. That date, oh, the date he died was July 18th, 2014. So I only know up to the 17th. I can't tell you what was happening that day, but I know everything up to that. So what I'd like you to do to begin the process is to think about what kind of questions you might want to ask. What I did at the museum, what I might have been doing at the museum, who I might have been doing it with, that might have led somebody or something to lead me to my demise. What I can tell you is that I was found in my office on the floor, and I can say more if that's what you choose to ask about. I also am surrounded by objects that were found in the office at the time from various programs he was involved with. If you ask, I'll pull them out. I can tell you about them. You can ask me questions about them. If they're not interesting, I can show you other objects. And with that, I will now program myself into observation mode until I see some questions in the chat.
So I've given everybody microphone privileges, and the way you turn your microphone on is to just click on the talk button under the image of Barry, and that will turn your mic on. If you want to raise your hand, and if you get a lot of responses, you can raise your hand. Otherwise, just turn your mic on, and you'll be polite.
I see two things that have come in. The first one was a question, and the second one's a request. I'll do the question first. Who didn't love Barry? From what we know, everybody loved Barry. That's part of one of the challenges that we have looking back, figuring out what might have happened. He was universally, generally liked. People liked working with him. In fact, he not only worked closely with his colleagues in the education department, where he was involved with after-school programs, primarily for middle school and high school students, but he got to work with people from around the museum in different departments. In the exhibitions department that designed the exhibitions, scientists, with people in the communications department, with people in microscopy, all sorts of areas. The second one was a request to see some objects. I will hold up two objects, and you guys can choose which one we'll talk about. While you guys are thinking...
Ray, do you know how to expand your chat window?
Yep, I see all the questions coming in.
Awesome.
We have vote for the card game. I'll talk about pterosaurs in a moment. First, we'll say, was there any signs of a struggle? We do see in the photographs that surrounding Barry were a bunch of small objects. How do we describe these objects? Pieces of filaments, pieces of plastic. All right, so I was asked to talk about what this box is. Let me see if I can get it in the right place. If you can't read it, it says Pterosaurs, the card game. On the front are two pterosaurs, and what it explains inside is that this content was connected with an exhibit that opened in the spring of that year, back in 2014, and that exhibit was all about pterosaurs. But before it opened, months in advance, all of the copies from the walls, the original art designed for the exhibit, were given to a group of high school students. And in a program called Science for the Win, rather, #ScienceFTW, Barry and the museum staff and some game designers worked with the students to create a card game that could be played to teach about food chains with pterosaurs at the top and biodiversity, And at the same time, all of the pterosaurs in the deck, most of them, if you held your cell phone up against them, cell phones were devices people used to use at the time to talk on the phone, it would augment the pterosaurs and they would fly off the cards. And then the cards were advertised in the exhibit. When the exhibit opened, they were available in the store for purchase, and they were available for free online, so they had wide distribution. This was the first time students in the education program at the museum co-developed with museum products, with the museum brand for the public, and at the same time that the museum put out not just interactives and puzzles, but an educational game. We'll go back and see what other questions we have. Was Barry happy? Yes, Barry was very happy. He loved working at the museum. He loved working with so many smart people in so many different departments who are all experts in their own areas. He loved how innovative the museum was in thinking about digital learning and all of the rich opportunities to work with such an incredible institution, such a venerable institution, which, while seeped in tens upon millions of objects in the collections, was still in the forefront of research in all sorts of areas. Was anything bothering him? Anything bothering him? He had complained a week earlier during one of the programs of something hurting in the back of his throat, but it was never heard again. Let's see what other questions we have here. What was Barry's precise involvement in developing the card game, and did someone print a dinosaur that came to life and killed Barry? Well, now in the year 2050, we are able to do organic printing. We're able to create kinetic tools with 3D objects. At that time, 3D printing was fairly new. The museum for many years had used digital fabrication. Of course, as a scientist, used it as part of their work to scan objects, to study them on computers, but printing was fairly new. And in fact, it was through some of the programs Barry was involved with that the museum got its first 3D printer. So there's a section in the museum called Imaging and Microscopy, where they have, for example, a $1 million CAT scan machine, and that's where scientists would go to get things scanned. But a year or two later, every so often, people were going to Barry to use his scanners and his printers. No dinosaur was printed that came to life. That wasn't available at the time, although we saw that in the news last week. All right, so what was Barry's precise involvement in developing the card game? Barry helped to develop the curriculum, hire the team of both science educators and game developers. Nick Bertugno is one of the game developers from Playmatics, and Giulio Cicello is one of the new educators in the museum who helped to run the program. Do we have access to Barry's notes, research, documentation? Well, yes, that's me. I am your access. Were those small objects bits of 3D printer plastic? Asked Dave. Yes, in fact they were. When they were explored in the lab, we saw that they were made of PLA, the corn-based plastic, which is a very popular form of printing material at the time before we had the ability to print with recyclable materials that could be put back into the machine. So one of the things that I want to ask you as we go through the object is that you have the perspective I don't, because you've been around since 2014 for the past 36 years. So if you have thoughts about how projects like this that I just described that empowered young people to co-produce public museum branded materials as well as putting out educational games has impacted our current state of museums, please feel free to share that as well. That could be interesting and could help shed some light on who might have been threatened by such projects out in the wide world or within the museum. Did Barry eat what was printed? No, he would not do that. He would never choose to do that. Were there any wounds seen on Barry's body? Yes, there was right on his back. There was a red mark, a blunt mark, my reports tell me. Was he killed because he or his projects were a financial threat to someone? That's for you to tell me. I don't know. How large was this red mark? Well, 3 inches wide by 5 inches high, you can say. Someone wants to see more objects. We'll pick some more objects to choose from. Okay. The mark was not the same size as the card. Were there any adults that didn't want teens to have the knowledge that the cards imparted? Not that we know of. Was the card game a financial success? Its goal wasn't to be a financial success, but to get wide distribution, and it did. Now waiting to see which objects you might choose to hear more about. One is Steve from Minecraft. The other one is a purple 3D printed dinosaur. We have 3 votes for Steve. This is Steve. We all know him from our history texts. He's the first famous character from the indie success Minecraft. And Barry did a number of projects with Steve and his world, exploring how this game, Minecraft, could be used for informal science learning. The first effort was a day-long program with Joe 11 from Teacher Gaming, who developed Minecraft EDU, which was the first thing he did before, well, we know what happened with them, but Minecraft EDU was a teacher version of Minecraft that would let us bring it into a classroom setting and have more control. And at the time, it was February 2013, the museum had an exhibit about food, about the science and culture of food, called Our Global Kitchen. And Barry and Joel, working with the teams, developed a day-long program that took youth into Minecraft to teach them some of the systems that were at work, both in the exhibit and the world, about how food is produced, processed, and distributed. And once they did that, in Minecraft, the youth then went to the real exhibit and saw what it looked like in the real world, learned about new things like global trade, and then came back into Minecraft where their small little village, which they've been taking care of, was now impacted by the opening of a global port. So essentially, things they learned in the game were developed to create a need to know when the youth went to the exhibit, and then they learned things in the exhibit that would help them do better in the game. And that program was successful enough that fall of 2013, they started Minecraft at the museum. That was a 25-session after-school program for high school youth. On one hand, to teach them about content in the museum by doing things in Minecraft and in the halls, but at the same time for the museum to learn from the students about what ways they learn science best through Minecraft. Was it by role-playing? Was it by building things? Was it by going on adventures? Was it by creating simulations? And it was a very interesting program, and began the museum's strategizing more intentionally about what role games could play in museum-based learning. Games that could be played, games that could be designed, games as pedagogy. We have a question here. The 2 individuals that Barry worked with, did they ever show any interest in the game being a for-profit? Oh, that's interesting. So I mentioned a few people. Nick Fortugno, who works for Playmatics, who developed the Terrorist card game. He works for a for-profit gaming company. And Joe 11's company is for-profit as well. At the time, generating funds by supporting teachers and educational institutions like museums to bring in games like Minecraft into their programs. Did Barry have any pets that felt slighted recently? A dog that wasn't taken for a walk the night prior, or a cat that was fed breakfast a half hour late? You know, speaking of cats, oh, can I remember the name? I have to go back into my database for this. Can't remember the cat's name. There wasn't a cat, but that was in Barry's home. But the Museum of Natural History, for those who didn't know, existed at the time, not where it is now, but in a park. It was next to Central Park, but it was a small park next to Central Park that was leased, if that's the right term, from the city to the museum. So in the park, there were all sorts of animals. And there was a particular orange cat that Barry would see occasionally, often sometimes during lunchtime, when he would give some food to. Would these individuals be restricted from expanding the products they developed from the museum into a different product line? Anyone we're working with are partners. So no one should be going off and using any IP we've developed through them or with them on their own. Was anything missing from Barry's office? Was there anything that shouldn't have been there? Well, Barry was responsible for making available decks of the Terrorist card game to educators who needed to use them in their programs. And while it was believed before he died that there was about 35 in a box, that box was missing. Red mark was on Barry's back, right? Was he found lying on his front or back? He was found on his front, face down. Were there other museums that were impacted negatively by Barry's successful project? As far as Barry was concerned, which is my only frame of reference, everyone was excited by these types of innovations going on in museums. He took inspiration from the work going on with all the digital fabrication going on at local museums like the Met, the Brooklyn Museum of Art, the Museum of Modern Art, and was proud to be one of these early institutions bringing 3D learning into the educational programs. In fact, many of them had presented together at a New York Museum Educators Conference just that spring. Did anyone really want to get a box that Barry wouldn't give him one? Oh, I see. In other words, is it possible there's somebody who had talked to Barry before who wanted the cards, but he wouldn't give it to them? Let me check my databases. Yes, it turns out there was a summer camp going on, a week-long summer camp on pterosaurs for 5th graders. And that educator, her name, Abby, had requested the cards, but unfortunately had requested them too late, and Barry had them committed for somebody else. Was there a 3D printer in the room, and was it on and actively printing? No, Barry managed about 6 printers, and the room was too small to hold them, so the printers were actually in the hallway outside next to the elevator. Was Barry's computer on? Barry's computer is usually on, but in fact it was not on at that time. It was believed to be, it was the 524. The notes say it was off. Did this educator have any kind of prior connection to Barry or the museum? Well, yes, actually, that leads to the educator who was involved in this program, micro rangers. Do you guys want to hear about these objects? Exclamation point, yes. No security camera. Sorry, Dave. So, Abby, who I mentioned, who was leading the pterosaurs camp for children, also led the Micro Rangers program in the spring. Now, Micro Rangers was actually not the name of the program. It was Micro Museum. And what it produced was this game called Micro Rangers. Susan Perkins, who was one of the scientists at the museum, worked with Abby and Barry, and a number of others as well. Marissa Yan from REM, for example, to do a program that was all about microscopic life and biodiversity and its impact on human health. And the game that they created was a geolocative game that used augmented reality, lots of buzzwords that people used back then, that would take the players from exhibit to exhibit and pretending to be microscopically small going into those exhibits and identifying what was happening at the microscopic level to cause problems. But the player wouldn't do it on their own. They would bring with them, let me see if this is viewable, these cards which represented different scientists: a microbiome specialist, an environmental specialist, a a disease specialist, and these scientists who lived at the macro scale would help you with the micro scale. So in the spring of that year, 2014, the students created, with the professionals, this mobile game that took you around from station to station. And again, using those smartphones that we all read about in history books, they would hold them up to the cards, and then a video would appear of the student in character talking to the player, giving them hints and clues, and guiding them along this game, in which they would go around solving these problems that were inside these exhibits. There were many students in the program, but unfortunately, there were only 4 cards. So not everyone got to play a role designing their characters, but everyone got to help write the scripts, identify the stories at the exhibits, and make the connection between the science content that's happening at the microscopic scale and an engaging story that would talk about how it could impact humans at our level and the planet overall. So, for example, one of the stories is about a buffalo farmer, a water buffalo farmer, who's making buffalo cheese, but he's not feeding his buffalo what he needs to, and as a result, it's way too flatulent. So you have to go into the buffalo's stomach, identify which bacteria is causing the excess methane production, and then figure out what the correct diet should be, working with the scientist. That scientist was played by this student, but unfortunately, the student who was, and we're happy for her, we're glad she got to do it, but there was a different student who, no, I got it wrong, I'm sorry, let me get this right. This is Daniel. Daniel played the environmental specialist, but a different student, a girl, was going to do it, but she just wasn't up to speed that day, and we asked Daniel to step in. He did a great job. So again, if it's helpful to identify clues, feel free to share back in the chat how the projects I'm talking about grew and had impact, both at the Museum of Natural History and at museums around the world over the succeeding 36 years, from 2014, when Barry passed away, to the year 2050, which is the year we're in now. And feel free to speculate if you're not sure. We have 5 more minutes. Maybe 10. We still have a whole bunch more objects. Any clues anyone wants to follow up on? Museums are seen as engines of economic growth and startups for entrepreneurship. Was time travel invented by 2050? I think you know the answer to that. More objects. All right. Which ones am I going to select next? I'm going to move some of these closer. You can see what this is. The light's coming through. The long one, which looks like a totem pole. A glass totem pole. You got it, Angela. All right. So this is a model that was made of one of the many totem poles in the museum's oldest hall from 1900, the Hall of Northwest Coast Indians. And our totem poles in the museum were cut into 3 because their ceilings aren't high enough. Somebody creatively went through, scanned each one, or figured out some way to represent it and put them all together, like this. And the reason why I'm sharing this object now is that while the hall goes back to 1900, at the time in 2013, it hadn't changed very much. It had changed, but it hadn't changed very much. And it reflected many of the ways that old museum halls had been developed. And as a result, people visiting the hall didn't always know where the communities were from. Maybe they thought they were from America when they're actually from the coast off of Canada, where the Canadian First Nations are. They also might have thought the people were dead, and they were not. And in fact, one of the projects Barry was working on at the time was with the Haida Nation. There's a Haida alcove. Each of the nations are represented in one or more alcoves. They're cultural objects kept together. The museum had very good relationships with the Haida Nation, and specifically the Haida Gwaii Museum. Haida Gwaii is where not only the majority of the Haida people live, but also actually where totem poles first began. And the Haida Gwaii Museum was a museum sharing both contemporary and historic cultural treasures from their community. And what Barry was exploring at the time, just as a prototype, was something to help augment visitors' experience to that room in a very interesting way. Nowadays, we can just teleport back and forth. But at the time, people were stuck in physical spaces and were very interested in the idea of place. And so 2 screens were set up. The top screen showed the person standing there in front of the screen, and the lower screen showed somewhere else. They were called video exchanges. No, video bridges. And there were 2 bridges, one there in the Haida alcove and one in the Haida Gwaii Museum. And the one in the Haida Gwaii Museum was exactly the same. 2 screens. The one on the top showed the person standing in the Haida Gwaii Museum, and one on the bottom showed somewhere else. And the somewhere else the 2 video bridges showed were the other video bridge, so people could see each other. But that was it. There was no audio. People could observe the other spaces. They could observe other people in the spaces. They might interact with each other by moving their hands, or waving, or writing notes. And that was the beginning of an exploration of how we could not rebuild the hall, but help rethink some aspects of the experience of that hall by using video technology at the time. To get people to recognize that while they were looking at the cultural objects in the Museum of Natural History in New York, those communities from which those objects came were alive and well. And in fact, if you turn around, might be looking at you and want to wave hi. Was there any blood or DNA found on the totem pole? Yes, so this object, as we said, was found by Barry's body when he was found dead. And there was some DNA found on it, actually. There was. Did the video bridge record what was happening, or was it live only? Well, it was a live event. It wasn't projected anywhere else, and it was recorded internally at the museum for security purposes and also for evaluation purposes. It's now time to make some guesses. We have a few minutes left before we end this exercise. Let's see if any of your final questions or accusations might be true. Was it Barry's DNA on the totem pole? Well, Barry's DNA was also on the totem pole. It was the one he used in a program, but Barry's DNA was not the only DNA on the program, on the totem pole. Was it Abby's? Nope, it was not Abby's. Whose else's DNA? My database is a little bit tricky. You need to ask me if it was a certain person's DNA. I can't just list people. I'll need to protect their anonymity unless they're specifically requested. Was it human DNA? Yes, it was human DNA. A student? Yes, it was a student at the museum. Daniel. Daniel is the one who was able to be on the card. Yes, in fact, it turns out it was Daniel. Congratulations, Alice. It turns out Daniel had made sure his fellow student wasn't healthy the day of that film shoot for Micro Rangers. And Barry found out. Daniel panicked when confronted by Barry, grabbed the totem, swung out in desperation, and, well, the rest is history. Congratulations. You guys have solved today's murder at the museum. Alice is verklempt. We're all moved. Yes, let's now remember, thank you, Laura, Barry. So now what do you want to do? We have 15 minutes together. I have more objects. But what strikes me at the time, Chris knows we're done. No one else is dead. Story's over. What might be more interesting is to think about what we see now and where we think it might be going. Some of the things that we just talked about. Christos doesn't want to stop. Christos, you can keep talking. That's fine. You can ask questions. What do we think about where games and games-based learning and museums are going? About the impact of mobile technology and mobile gaming. For the museums to not just give their name so other companies can produce stuff, but they can produce their own educational activities. For the ability to use internet technology to connect people in different places. And while I didn't go into it in detail, but I alluded to it as well, the impact of digital fabrication and what it means for museum learning. I hope I got your name right. Orinoke, welcome. You were late. None of what we just did will probably make any sense. So have fun and good luck. I know you're waiting for me to say something. I'm waiting for you guys. Steve says museums and libraries are much more aligned as models to envision changes in education. I think that's been true for a while. Henry Jenkins, who started the early publications funded from MacArthur's Digital Media and Learning Foundation, when he put out his report on digital literacies, spoke about how after-school learning spaces had some of the most hope for change because we were less restricted. The problem, of course, is most of the kids are in school. That's always a challenge back and forth. Ken, I'm going to read all the questions here. Ken, have you found any kind of games work better than others for museums? Barry, which projects you have done do you think will make the biggest change? Nice. Alice, games are wonderful, but how would you use something like this in a history museum? Okay, like Holocaust. And Dave, you'll need the future version of the video bridge so that visitors to the museum will be able to see all the artifacts that return to First Nations. That will be a virtual reality bridge. Well, that will be an actual reality bridge if they're all if they leave the museum. But that's a separate conversation. So, games that work better. One of the things that's been so interesting for me over these last 2 years is how many different ways there are to use games. I didn't know anything about Pokemon or collectible card games when I started at the museum. In fact, it was the summer just before I started at the museum that my son just started using Pokemon. And it's in the last year and a half that I learned a lot about these games. And that was part of what inspired Pterosaurs, just to connect the dots. The Pterosaur game is based on Philo. Philo is a card game that was made by a scientist in Vancouver, crowdsourcing it, that's based on Pokemon. And so I've learned a lot about how fabulous card games can be, and specifically collectible and trading card games to engage youth and teach content, as well as how the indie and Euro gaming revolution is bringing physical games into people's homes and classrooms to teach about very specific content that games in the past could not have done. When we think of specific content, we might think in the past like Trivial Pursuit, where it's just facts and figures, and there's a fun game around it. But most games are abstract concepts, like Monopoly, buy property, sell property, a game of life where you move around a board. But games today can talk about literally the week-by-week specifics of the Kennedy versus Nixon campaign, or about the history of the Cold War, that one's the Twilight Struggle. And so there's lots of opportunities just in the physical space to explore games. At the same time, I love digital games, virtual games. There's a tremendous amount there. I want to go with Alice said. Alice says, games are wonderful, but how would you use them like this in a history museum where the events of the Holocaust don't really lend themselves to immersion? That's interesting. I actually worked with the Holocaust Museum many years ago to create Witnessing History, which, as Orinoco mentioned earlier, I used to do a lot in Second Life. And working with students at the museum, working from New York, running a program for the summer in D.C., they created a simulation of Kristallnacht. Not the actual event the day after, and you were in the role of a reporter who came in interviewing the non-player characters, the characters who were there, to find out what happened and then write your story. So even topics that are very intense and very detailed, I think can be explored in games and immersion. And of course, there are games that have been made about the Holocaust. One was by, I'm not going to pronounce her name right, Brenda Brathwaite, I believe. I think it was called Train, which is more of an art experience than a game, but it's designed to use game as a modality, in which you don't know that you're moving your train cars, why you're moving your cattle cars, and then you realize why. So I think there's a lot that can be explored with games, not just because they're fun, because not all topics are fun, Holocaust isn't fun, but can be deeply engaging. When you want people to learn about something as intense as the Holocaust, you want them to be engaged. Elizabeth asked, which of the projects have you done so far will make the biggest change in how you do things in the future? Well, one of the reasons why I wanted to bring in how we develop the Terrorist card game, I think is really important. It highlights the opportunities that museums like ours that are object-based, the opportunities we have to give youth access to those objects and repurpose them somehow in the world. We've worked with Mouse Squad. Mouse Squad is an after-school program around the country where the youth are the tech support for their school. And the youth squads come into the museum, scan our objects, and then bring them back to their school and use them in their classes. You can scan objects, you can take content and bring them into games, you can bring them into Minecraft. There's so much we can do. And as we increase our abilities and our knowledge about how to effectively use digital tools in education and to engage the public, we have more opportunities to have youth not just learn by coming into our spaces or into our online sites, but to be part of the development of that process and have them help us teach that. I'm going to try and process this one by reading it. Sarah says, sounds like you are in a wonderful position with the same group of kids over time for sustained and evolving experience. Any tips or takeaways for drop-ins? Oh, good question. So a little bit my background. I started working with young people regularly in 2000, working at Global Kids, a New York City-based after-school organization for 12 years. That's where I learned youth development. That's where I learned what it meant to do youth media projects and how to bring digital media into those projects. And most of those projects, because they were project-based, were year-long programs, intensive investigations into intense topics like child trafficking and child soldiers, but doing it through things like making machinima and Second Life or making video games about poverty in Haiti. Those don't work well for drop-in. But there were many programs at Global Kids that were about drop-ins, and those were the places where we can then engage young people to scale them into the other programs. So at the museum, we tend to not have drop-in programs. They're more, if you look at the Hamago model, which again comes from the Digital Media Learning Initiative, the hanging out, messing around, can I do this live? Hanging out, messing around, and geeking out, we tend to do more of the second two. The geeking out, where students get to work with scientists over a year doing research, or the messing around, where they're learning about a new content area to them, geology, astrophysics, paleontology, and getting to see what it's like. We don't have a lot of the hanging out. We don't have opportunities to come to check things out, but we're starting to explore some of that. Creating games that people can engage with, and ways to engage with it in the museum are part of that. We have youth cafes where an adult expert comes in to talk with the youth, and you can just come and drop in and just check it out. And that's new for us, and many, many more have done much more and learned much more about that, and I need to learn from them. Reading some more questions. Have any of these games led to action, learning about a subject, and then actively engage in it? No, that we know of, not that we know of, but they're all new. Pterosaurs, the game, came out in April. Micro Rangers is still just a prototype, and we're considering now whether to develop it. Our work with Minecraft was only internally. Nothing the youth developed, except for videos you can see of it online, were shared publicly. But all these things are things that can both scale, and can have greater impact. So I hope you'll ask me that question in 5 years. And it's possible, if they're designed to, that some of these games can have impacts in the real world. Not just about people learning, and not just about them choosing to pursue their new passions or an existing passion deeper. If the game was designed to do so. We have 2 more minutes. Are folks paying admission to participate in these games and programs? So if you're in New York City and you have a kid and you want them to go to a program at the Museum of Natural History, there's programs you can pay for, there's programs that have no fees, and there's mixed fees where there can be scholarships. So for all the experiments I've talked about, because they're experiments, and we don't want to experiment on the kids through our educational programs, those tend to be largely free programs. And they're experimenting with us how to do this type of learning, this type of science learning in a museum. Orinoco wants to make a distinction by saying maybe we should talk about serious games or games for good. And yes, serious games and games for good or games for change, those are part of the subset of what I'm talking about, but they're only part of the whole. I will talk about games-based learning. And games-based learning might be intentionally making games to have an impact on others. It might be educational games that are designed to teach. But it also might be the experience is game-like. So for example, we haven't talked about badges yet, and something I've been involved with a lot, both at the museum and around the country, are digital badges, which are not a game, but bring aspects of games and what you are used to experiencing with digital games into an informal learning space. And I would say that's not about serious games or games for good, that's just a part of the larger umbrella of games-based learning. So before we leave in the next minute, I would like to hear from you about one thing you found interesting that you are going to want to learn more about. And while you're doing that, I'm going to type in my blog, where I talk about not just the work at the museum, but wherever I'm interested in this intersection of digital learning and museums. And you also see my Twitter handle. Oh, Elizabeth, I'd love to take you into Minecraft. I know you're out there. I see you in the list. Tell me things that were of interest to you. Please share back to everyone else. I was trying to remember a name before and I couldn't, so while you're writing something, I'll share. I just learned about Stampy Longhead, or Stampy Cat, who is a guy who makes videos in Minecraft. They're educational, sometimes they're funny, and I think he has the second largest traffic channel right now on YouTube. And one of the interesting things about our Minecraft programs is that not everyone in the programs had played Minecraft. But they had all seen videos of people playing Minecraft on YouTube, which speaks to the different modes of engagement. So I wrote out Steve like he was a character. But what I find so interesting is that when my son watches Stampy Longhead's videos, he can watch the video, but he's watching a video of this guy going into other people's Minecraft maps, and then in the link in YouTube, you can then download those maps and then play them. It's completely integrating the consumer participatory experience. I'll type it in. Stampy Longhead. He's working with Disney now to make Minecraft-based science educational videos, I believe. Stampy Longhead. Way to end. Thank you all for playing with me today. Again, I talked about games-based learning. We were playing together and turning this experience into something playful where I could take risks. I had no idea who killed me. I didn't know where we were going to go together based on your questions, but through improvisation, through you participating with me, by you taking risks and chance, we're able to talk about these important ideas and I hope have fun at the same time and also model ways of learning that I hope we can consider bringing more into our informal learning spaces. Thank you so much. Steve, back to you.
Thanks, Barry. I have to explain every time that it's hard to find the applause button there, but hover over the smiley face, and you can go to the applause. You can raise your hand, whatever you'd like to do. That was really fun. We've got just a couple of minutes, so do feel free to jump out and take a quick break. Thanks, Barry. We've got 3 great sessions coming up. They're in your schedule, and I think Amy has also posted them in the chat on the website. I'm going to turn the recording off, and you'll also notice that I keep you out of the room so the recording can process, and it will be up in about 10 minutes. And then the YouTube version of it will be up in a couple of days. Thanks, everybody. Bye.